Dank u vriendelijk om hier vandaag te zijn. I'm going to switch to English because for this session we're teaming up with VOX-Pol, which is an Irish-based think tank on online radicalization. So that's why we're not going to speak either in French or Dutch, but you can always ask your questions in one of those languages or in English, of course. So voilà, it's the fourth session, so thank you for coming here. I think we already had like 3 interesting sessions, and we still have 2 to come. But maybe I will leave the word to this person who's our contact in VOX-Pol.
Thank you, Nadej. Hi there, I'm Liz Pearce, and I've been moderating the sessions as we've been going through. This is the 4th session of 6. We've got 2 more to come. As Nadej mentioned, we're doing this in conjunction with the European Commission this year, and VOX-Pol is basically a European Union funded network of excellence. So we fund a lot of different research into online political extremism. Today we have Dr. Matti Pohjonen, who's come from Finland. He's a research fellow for VOX-Pol, and he's leading a team on research on the extreme right. He is presenting today some comparative research on hate speech and online political extremism, particularly around the refugee crisis in Europe. So look forward to hearing from Dr. Pohjonen today. Thanks, Matti.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks everybody for coming. So I think what we'll do today is we'll talk for about half an hour, and then hopefully we'll have a lively discussion afterwards. So what I'll be presenting today is actually the final results, or almost the final results of about 12 months of research that I have been doing for VOX-Pol as a research fellow this year. So there'll be a lot of kind of tentative rough results that I've been kind of collecting in the past month or so. But the idea of these results is in a way to raise discussions about what I think is one of the most important topics that is facing especially Europe, and especially research on social media today. And it links directly to the work of VOX-Pol in terms of online radicalization, in terms of far-right extremism, in terms of contemporary political events such as the Trump elections, which I think are happening as we speak. So it'll be interesting to see how things look tomorrow in this kind of new emerging universe of discussion. So what I'll do today is I'll provide a very brief background to the research that I've been doing this year, and in terms of why I think a comparative approach is very important. I'll also talk quite in detail about research design methods and case study, and I'll explain the rationale for doing so. Then I'll provide some of the preliminary findings and some of the results, and in the end I'll provide some conclusions as the kind of basis for discussion, as well as some conjectures. So conjectures being that these are the kind of talking points that I want to raise as a way of, and I'm sure all of you have your own interest in regards to hate speech, and especially the kind of discussion that has been going on this year around the refugee crisis. And in terms of comparative work, I'll start first the background. So why I think comparative approach can help in counter-violent extremism research. And I have to go all the way back to Ethiopia to get started with this discussion. And don't worry, we'll come back to Europe eventually. But this previous work that I've done is very important to frame some of the debates and some of the kind of issues that I'll be discussing today. So what we did for, I worked previously on a 2-year project for University of Oxford, and we were mapping hate speech and online debates in Ethiopia, which is a very different country, very different context on what is happening in Europe. And what happens in Ethiopia is that hate speech has become a very politicized term. So nobody really has a clear definition of what is meant by hate speech, except for the fact that it's usually meant by either the government or the opposition to discredit the other person. So if you don't like somebody politically, you're engaging in hate speech. So the opposition says the government is engaging in hate speech, whereas the government says the opposition is, and people get arrested and all that stuff. And so coming from a comparative perspective, especially looking at the East European, East African context, is that there is a much more kind of ethnic violent history behind why people are very concerned about hate speech. So we think about Rwandan genocide, we think about electoral violence in Kenya, we think about thousands of people that were killed. So there's a very sensitive issue. So we started working on a project of, okay, let's see how much hate speech in fact we can find within the limited social media discussion in Ethiopia. And we hosted workshops with both the opposition and the government. So here we have members of civil society, media, opposition, government, including the ex-president of Ethiopia, some state minister of communication, and we tried to get the debate, okay, how should we come up with a way of understanding this term? How should we understand the way of what in fact is meant by this? Because it's such a term that is politically used in a very sensitive climate. sensitive political climate. So we came up, to cut a long story short, we came up with a very complex framework of mapping out hate speech, which we mapped out for almost 6 months, and we had 8 coders who were manually coding. We mapped a total of 14,000 manually coded statements looking at the level of hate speech and the level of extreme language being used in social media conversations. And we also used a very complex to subdivide hate speech into very many different elements. So the idea was that we don't want to use this term as a blanket term, but rather look at many different aspects and elements that come into it. So things like offensive speech, hate speech, we had danger speech in terms of can it lead potentially to some kind of offline violence, and we had a danger speech with risk of violence, which was the kind of worst kind of speech. And so we subdivided, we used a lot of complicated analysis, and in the end we found out that it's very marginal. So a very small part of the speech, in fact, in an ethnically polarized society was considered hate speech, or even less so was considered dangerous speech. And most of the discussions in Ethiopia were actually politically very engaging and very positive. So we're like, okay, of course we tried to present the results to the government, but they weren't very happy listening to us because they thought that social media discussions are mostly hate speech and has to be censored. So now Ethiopia has a state of emergency, and they've shut down most of social media activity altogether. So as a way of kind of a comparative context, it was an interesting background coming back to Europe, is that we've been trying to convince the government that hate speech in fact is marginal, and we don't want to censor hate speech when we start doing something, because in terms of politics it's not the best thing to do. It can be an excuse for censoring social media. And then coming back into Europe, where the debate seems to be going the contrary way currently, that okay, hate speech has become a massive problem and we should try to find ways of cutting down or censoring, and Facebook has launched a new program of trying to cut down censoring hate speech as quickly as possible. So it put me in a kind of a schizophrenic position as I came to my new research project, that on the one hand I've been recommending that we should not censor hate speech because it's actually can lead to all kinds of negative political consequences, and on the other hand the debate currently going on seems to be going to another way, that we should censor hate speech. And so this is the kind of dilemma that I brought into research when I started doing. So in terms of methodologies, the importance that we should not only focus on hate speech, but rather the more broader context and the political climate and the reasons around it. And also in terms of comparative research, that we should not see it as a universal category, but we should understand more what is going around it, what is happening, and then also the kind of relationship of communication behind it. So, of course, I'm not going to be talking about Ethiopia today, so we are very familiar about what has been going on for the last about 10 months in Europe. And this is this picture pretty much explains it, that refugees not welcome. So around the recent refugee crisis, there has been a massive emergence and explosion of hate speech on social media. And we see it in different countries in Europe, in Germany, in Finland, in other countries, and it has been seen that it's one of the biggest social media phenomena that has been going on in the past year. So there's a few examples, and I've taken these from Finland, but I think they are quite applicable in a lot of other countries, and I apologize for the strong language that we find here. So basically talking about these rats should be exterminated. We should shoot them into holes, add some fuel and burn them. This will warm our feet. Being Finland, you have to stay warm. So, and these are people who are posting behind their own profile names. You can go to their picture, you can find them with their kids, and this is very common. And this is so there is also another one, which is one of the biggest online anti-immigration news sites. And again, the example is from Finland, where basically it recommends using the references to the Holocaust, that they should be all gassed. And there should be Muslims the hell out of Europe, niggers too. We should make fertilizer out of them. So we see a very, very vitriolic, aggressive language. And I'll talk later. I found about 60,000 of these very easily by going through some social media comments. So it's very common. You can find this kind of and this is the most aggressive kind of recommending people to be burned, gassed, thrown in the oven, and other things. So some of the observations coming as a kind of reverse anthropologist working on Ethiopia and coming back into Europe, that this is very weird, that in fact the hate speech around the refugee crisis seems to have become more vitriolic and violent than what I found in Ethiopia or in East African countries, where we have seen history of mass ethnic violence. So again, the reference point would be the Rwandan genocide, where up to 1 million people were killed, partially catalyzed by some of the violent speech that was promoted. And another thing is that a very widespread mistrust of mainstream news media and the use of alternative online sources for knowledge. So this happens in a lot of, what has been going on, that people increasingly seem to be trusting mainstream media as a source of information less, but going into alternative news sites to find the kind of information that they want. And these news sites are also aggressively promoting an alternative framing of the immigration crisis or of the refugees, often going into very aggressive remarks or often aggressive ideology against them. And then there's also the purposeful dissemination of propaganda by the extreme far right. And I'll be focusing a bit more on the extreme far right part of this, because it's part of a very big research, and because we are dealing with violent online political extremism. So these are the kind of different components that I'll bring in the talk today, and then hopefully towards the end of it, we'll see how they start all coming together and making more sense. So when I started my research, the problem was that how do we then research this? And how does hate speech propagate on social media networks? How does it compare to other kinds of speech? And in the Ethiopian context, we saw that there was a lot of engagement, that we saw that it wasn't all about hate speech. And what role do different social media groups have in promoting or countering this kind of speech online? And what are the kind of communicative dynamics behind them? And how do we understand the role of these alternative news sources? And also the more specific question of how certain far-right extremism potentially spread hate propaganda and what might be the effect. In other words, how dangerous is hate speech? So if we find 50,000 comments of people recommending violent action against refugees, how dangerous is it? And of course the question here is that in terms of offline violence or certain political consequences. So the last 12 months I've been working on the VOX-Pol research trying to address these questions. And this is the first time that I'm actually presenting a lot of these things today, so it'll be interesting to also see the kind of feedback that is coming from the audience. So the phase one of my research was a more critical, conceptual part of looking at the debates on violent online extremism, and also looking at debates on hate speech and coming up with a much more conceptual framework to begin from. And the phase two was to develop and scale up data analysis methods to analyze social media hate speech during the refugee crisis. Unfortunately, VOX-Pol doesn't support me that well, that I couldn't hire 8 coders to do the work, so I had to find ways that could we somehow use some of the more big data methods to understand some of these communicative dynamics, and in a way to understand it in a bigger scale rather than looking at just a few examples that we have seen so far. So, and here is where the Finland part comes in, and I wish I didn't work on Finland. It's one of the most difficult languages to work with, but Finland actually has one of the most interesting debates on hate speech and immigration going on currently, and I'll shortly explain why. And so this is basically from January, there's 2 major groups in Finland, and who have very active social media presence. One of them is called Close the Borders, and it's called Rajat Kiinni, and the other one is called No Racism in My Name, or Rasmus, and they both have very big online social media presence, and they organize demonstrations and counter demonstrations. But even more interestingly, they are all very active on Facebook, and they are public groups on Facebook. So it allows me to use the Facebook API to download all the data that they have available. And even more interestingly, 2 administrators from the Rajat Kiinni and the Rasmus group have set up a group in between, whose aim is to try to have a civilized dialogue between racists, anti-racists, and people in between. So they have a set of rules of what is acceptable and allowed in terms of carrying out this kind of dialogue. And it's a very interesting experiment, and I'll talk briefly about it. And there's a lot of things. And so you can see the numbers that are quite significant in terms of groups. So the anti-refugee group has up to 654,000 comments, and this is the stuff that I've downloaded from them. So we are dealing up to almost 1 million posts and comments that I have as the kind of data set that I can work with. Because these are public groups, you can download everything from the Facebook API. So we get an interesting social network structure between the 3 groups. And this is a random sample of 20,000. I took from about 840,000 comments of who comments and posts and whom. So very polarized, anti-racist and racist, so to speak, anti-refugee, anti-racist, and then we have the in-between dialogue. So it provides a very interesting kind of framework to start trying to analyze, okay, what kind of conversations could be happening between these different groups. And so then the question becomes that we have 840,000 comments and posts. How do we start researching them? How do we make sense of them? And I don't, again, have the chance to hire 8 researchers, so there has to be some other ways of trying to make sense of them. So how do we understand hate speech, so-called hate, I'll use it in quotation marks, hate speech in these groups? How do we understand engagement, dialogue, all kinds of different things that come with social media discussions, and especially on the refugee crisis? And this is the reason why I think Finland is such an interesting example, is that you don't find these dynamics so dominant in any other place. So I thought that I have a very unique data set that I can start analyzing and looking very in detail at some of the conversations that are going on and what could be in a way discovered from these conversations. So, so when I started looking into them, a very typical factor of Facebook today is that most people don't anymore write status updates. They usually link to some external source. So it might be a news source, it might be a video source, it might be a photo, but this is looking at the anti-immigration group. You can see that up to about 70%, 75% of all things that are posted include a link to some other source. So it might be a news site, it might be a different Facebook group, another Facebook post, and so to speak. So we get a certain communication structure that we can start using as the basis for analysis. So we have a news source where a certain kind of knowledge is being produced. We have a post where it's being shared and commented on in certain ways, and then we have a comment, which is a way of kind of responding and having a conversation around this. So I thought, okay, this might be an interesting way of actually starting to look at some of the questions of how certain types of information are disseminated, where they're actually being sourced from, where do they come from, and how they are being debated in different groups. So in our network representation, we get what is called a multi-level network structure. So this includes posts, comments, and a news source. So we can start mapping out this relationship into a more graphical way that then can be analyzed much more in scale. So okay, this makes sense. We can start looking at this. So this is based on one day. So we are dealing with over a period of 10 months. You can see a very complex kind of change that takes place in these different kinds of network structures. So and then so I said, okay, let's try to look at. So I looked at different sampling strategies and the importance that we don't want to only look at certain examples that confirm what we are looking at. So we look at random sample to see what is the kind of prevalence or the baseline according to which this kind of conversation takes place in these different groups. We look at I also wanted to look at event-based samples. So what in fact happens around major events such as terrorist attacks in Brussels and Nice. So could we find some kind of patterns that if there is a major terrorist attack, would there be an explosion of certain kind of conversations? Would the far right try to promote certain kinds of information around this? Is there a way of actually looking at this very empirically and in detail? So also one of the things that I wanted to look at is this question of that if we have these alternative news sources that have become dominant, how do they compare to so-called traditional media or mainstream news sources? Are there certain dynamics of communication that are different between a far-right extreme online news site and then between, for instance, a mainstream news site? And then also thick data, basically looking at certain examples and case studies and looking at some of the things that we can find there. So again, the question is that we have this complex data set. How do we make sense of it? So I started using certain kind of contemporary methods in data analysis that could be used to make sense of bigger data sets that you can actually look at manually. So one of the ways that I looked at this is called dynamic social network analysis, and this is basically mapping out these conversations in a network form and looking at changes over time. So you can start looking at measures of centrality and other measures that have been developed to understand the dynamics of networks. So questions such as where does different kinds of speech originate from, and do these sources change over time? How does the information from different knowledge sources propagate over time in different social networks, posts and comments, and who are potentially the key entities, and what are their spheres of influence over time? And some of the methods that I was looking at would include things like static and dynamic social network analysis and near impact analysis. And I'm not going too much into detail into this, and because these are slightly more technical, so we can move on to actually what these tools allow us to discover. And so the second thing that I want to look at is that there is a lot of semantic content there. So we're dealing with up to 800,000 posts and comments and other things. So how do we understand what is being said in these things? How do we understand what kind of conversations are being had? What are the differences between different groups and other things? So in fact, what is the relationship between the semantic content in the sources, the posts and the comments, and how does this change over time? So and also how is it different during certain events, different types of speech, and in different ideological groups? So again, some technical stuff, but there are a lot of contemporary methods and mechanisms that can be used to analyze larger chunks of text. And some of the things that we are looking at, and I'll discuss this slightly more in a bit, is things like word associations and topic modeling, which is a part of machine learning, and then also supervised classification, which is also a part of machine learning. So there are ways of actually allowing to detect patterns within larger chunks of data. And one of the most difficult things that I encountered doing this is that because Finnish is such a weird language, it took me a long time to try to figure out how to condense Finnish into just the root words. And this required some computer scientists from University of Amsterdam to do it because it was so difficult. In English it's very easy, but once you go into Finnish or some of these complex languages, the methods of doing that are very complex. So I also managed to only come up with the root words of all the examples, which allow us to look more accurately at the kind of conversations that are going on. So examples as this, and I'm not sure if you can see it there, but this is just an example of what would be word associations. So I took this from a sample of 10,000 from the anti-immigration group, and some of the things that would correlate closely with the term Islam. And this is not in terms of word frequency, it's measuring word frequencies according to importance in the text using what is called frequency inverse document frequency. So we get religion, terrorist group, shite, we get psychological mental illness, degenerate Daesh. So we can see already the kind of conversations that are being promoted in these groups. And another thing that what I did was what is called topic modeling. And I'll discuss more about some of the results later, but these are just some of the techniques that could be used. So topic modeling is a machine learning technique that determines automatically topics from large corpuses of text. So I ran it through multiple different ways. So this is based on a sample of 50,000 comments. And I looked at 10 different potential topics that would emerge from these comments. So again, an example, these are some topics that are mostly about killing and religion. So again, you can see what you instinctively, by observing some of the conversations, you can start seeing that some of the topics that emerge are relatively accurate. So this is about Islam, killing, Christian, Muhammad, Allah, and so it comes up with certain kind of words that the algorithm thinks that are the same topic, and it allows you to kind of structure larger conversations into smaller chunks of analysis. And finally, what I did was then I came up with okay, I want to see how do you detect certain kinds of speech that exist within the corpus itself. So how would you detect something that could be in a way quotation mark called hate speech? So I started trying out with different what I call supervised machine learning methods. So you come up with a set of text and you try to identify. You go through about 2,000 of them and you classify them as some. Let's say this would be considered so-called hate speech or whatever you want to call it, and then you would test it on the rest of the set. And so I tried many different ways, and the best way of doing it was to it's quite simplistic. So I focused mostly on curse words and derogatory terms, and I managed to go through multiple different iterations up to about a 90% accuracy in terms of how the system was able to predict or label so-called hate speech words. So these are the very kind of, when you say that if in nigger would be something that would be determined, okay, so it uses these certain keywords and there are lots of them. So I went through multiple iterations, and so I managed to automatically label every comment and post that was done according to whether it was other or hate speech. So we start seeing both the social network around it, but also a manual labeling of the kind of comment that exists there. So this is the kind of the methodological multiple different things, and I'm going to pause here for a second, and there will be probably about 3 hours worth of material that I could talk about. As you can see, that it's been quite comprehensive in terms of the different things that I've been trying. But what I will try to do is keep it reasonably simple and narrow it down to just one very small section of the research that I've done. And that links to the original question that is there some kind of influence or relationship that extreme far-right online news sites would have with the promotion of hate speech? And again, because I have such a massive data set, there would be probably 10 different things that I could talk about, and I can bring in some examples from the discussion. But when I was trying to see how can I fit this into half an hour presentation, I narrowed it down into one very simple question. So we'll try to go from there, and then we can open up some of the other discussions slightly more later. So in Finland, you have another interesting thing in Finland is that they pretty much know everybody. So they know who's doing what, they know who are the key people behind the far right, they know how the networks are linked, net sites are linked, websites are linked. They know, so this is a very complex graph that was done in the major newspaper of how the so-called alternative extreme far-right news scene works in Finland. So you have, so for here, for instance, you would have the Finnish resistance movement, which is a neo-Nazi movement. So they have a website which linked to the most popular anti-immigration site. Then you have slightly more anti-Semitic, anti-vaccination, all kinds of conspiracy stuff. And then you have, so there's a very big kind of a network of different news sites that are constantly being done, trying to promote a certain alternative perspective to politics. And I'm sure this also exists in other European countries. So, but because it's so well known, it provides a very interesting example of looking at And then you have forums and blogs, and then there's some kind of also links to Ukrainian resistance and other things. So it's a very complex kind of network, but people know pretty much how it works, so there's no surprise beyond it. But what is even more interesting, a couple of weeks ago, so what I mentioned is the biggest anti-immigration online news site. So they have actually issued an arrest warrant for the founder of the site, and this is from the main Finnish online news site. So because of its extreme far-right slant, so there's a lot of derogatory. So some of the reasons have been things like slander, libel, attacks against certain groups. So it's actually, but it's based in Spain, so they can't shut it down. But they've issued the European arrest warrant against the founder of the group, and in order to try to get him to come to court for some of the stuff he said. So there's also an interesting political thing going on. So what I was interested in seeing is that how could we then understand this particular magazine, newspaper, which is, if you look at in terms of some of this popularity in terms of the sites that are being shared, in, for instance, in the anti-immigration group, you can see that it's now the 4th largest source of information, and all the red ones are linked to this network that I mentioned here. So we are seeing a very big chunk of information that is sourced, or knowledge that is being sourced, is in fact done or produced by some of these extreme far-right networks. So, I did this graph of the different groups, so you can see that up to like 20% at least is being produced, of the things that are being produced, even more sometimes, are being produced or sourced from these extreme far-right networks. So okay, so we have this quite high use of extreme far-right news sources as the source for information against the immigration crisis. So what impact or what consequence would this have on debate on hate speech, or how hateful would the comment be based on the framework that I decided? So okay, how do we understand this, and how do we understand that how serious this in fact is? So as we can see, there's some of the most shared sites include, of course, Facebook and YouTube would be the most common, but then you see mainstream sites, but then you also see all kinds of marginal sites and UK tabloids and other things. So I started looking at, okay, now that we have built this network where you can look at both the source of information, the post and comment, we can start looking at how important node is a certain news site in the network. So what I did is this is a measurement of the centrality of both of these that is based on this is based on about an 8-month sample, so within a weekly range, how important is it, or how central is it as an important source of information. So we see that what is actually very interesting, which I wasn't expecting, is that the alternative news site and the mainstream news site are pretty much correlated. So they are not that much difference, so you don't see any kind of big, so they seem to be about the same centrality in the network. So by centrality I mean how many people post it and comment on. So that's just a measurement of how important this as a kind of instigator of conversation. Like, okay, that's very interesting. So okay, let's see what else we can find. So then I started looking at, okay, what is the kind of prevalence of, based on the framework that I decided of labeling every comment in the network or the post and comment. So how much so-called hate speech would there be? So this is the entire group itself, which is the Close the Borders group. So we see, okay, there's significant amount, but it's very steady. It's like this murmur in the background that keeps on kind of going, and there's not massive spikes on it. This is based on a weekly sample of on the average of how much there is. So we see, okay, fine. It's about 8% of all the posts and comments tends to be of the worst kind of cursing and swearing and other things, and some of the comments that we saw earlier. So then I wanted to see, okay, if that's the case, if you look at the extreme far right side, how would that then differ? So then, okay, we saw, okay, very interesting. Not much more. There's certain spikes and certain kinds of things going back and forth, but again, on the average, there seems to be a similar amount of this kind of aggressive, hateful comments also in the far right sides. So somehow there doesn't seem to be a major correlation between the source of information and the kind of conversation that goes on behind it. Okay, so let's see what else we could do. So then I started looking at, okay, where is it found mostly, these comments? So it turned out that they tend to be the most aggressive comments tend to be found in status updates in their comments. So when you have somebody ranting about something, they get a lot of popularity, and there are a lot of comments around that, and so then other people join in to rant about some issue, and then links and photos and videos come. But also, and this is quite steady across all the different groups. So it's okay. This seems to be a very steady kind of pattern that seems to be reproducing across all the different groups. So then I want to see, okay, let's look at how influential, again, to see, okay, let's look at compare the mainstream news site and then the alternative extreme far right news site and see how much hate there would be within their social networks. So this is a comparison that you can find between what they call spheres of influence. And so you can see the red dots are comments or posts. These are actually posts that would represent some of the labeled hate speech comments. So we see, okay, it doesn't really seem to be that much different. There's no major kind of presence that exists within so this one here would be actually the alternative one, and the other one would be the mainstream. So it's quite similar. So okay, so then again, there doesn't seem to be a major correlation between the work done by the kind of extreme right so-called propaganda and hate speech there. So then I started looking, okay, let's look at responses to it. So how do we look at responses within social media conversations? So this is basically a comparison between average likes, shares, and comments over the time period. One is the general sample, and one is all the comments that I have labeled as so-called hate speech. So we see some differences which are quite interesting, that in the more hateful comments you see much more spikes that are happening, whereas in the general sample, especially in terms of like, it tends to be kind of much less kind of what do you call this, having this sudden spikes. And again, these are based on daily averages, so you can see again there are certain days and certain kind of things that cause a lot of kind of passion in people. And then I looked at the same thing. Okay, let's look at terrorist attacks. So I looked at the Brussels attacks, and this is also the selected statements regarding hate in terms of, almost done. So you can see that there is a big spike happening of this kind of emotion that takes place around, for instance, this happens on exactly just after the Brussels terrorist attacks that happened. You have much a spike in the average likes and shares and stuff like that. And also when you look at statistics like the kind of average and medians, you can see that they get much more response from people. And finally, one of my most interesting graphs, which is basically, I started also looking at what time of day do people post certain things. So we start seeing that the pattern tends to be that the most hateful comments are done in Facebook and YouTube at night, and then the mainstream news media sites, perhaps because they're working or they're not drunk yet, they tend to focus on the mainstream news and the tabloids. So you can see also patterns of how people behave on social media during certain periods of time. So what I found interesting about this, from coming from an anthropology background, that you start seeing that there are certain kind of human dynamics behind at play also, what's going on. So what do we make all of this? We have 5 minutes, so I'm going to raise a set of questions that we will come up with. So we have seen a very complex picture of how certain extreme online news sites and this so-called labeled hate speech relate to, and what seems to be going on in this subsection of my research. So I came up with the 4 kind of tentative findings that we could raise as points of discussion. One of the things that we tend to see in alternative media universe emerging between the different groups, where there are very different different sources that are being accessed. And so the anti-immigration and the far-right activists have set up a parallel news network online where anti-immigrant news is commonly shared, and the anti-racist group tends to be more close to mainstream. And the group in between kind of straddles between the 2 different things. So also we see echo chambers and counter speech, that if you look at in detail at some of the conversations in the in-between dialogue group, we can see that it has been slowly taken over by the anti-immigration side. And the dynamics tends to be that, please notice us, we are here, we want our voices heard, instead of, so the dialogue is much more about kind of trying to get attention. And then we have things like there doesn't seem to be any relationship between the type of information and the type of comment that is being posted, or type of post that is being posted. So it tends to be more like oppositional readings, that people take a news article and then they frame it the way they want, and then they say something about it. So that's one of the key things that came out. And as a point of discussion, I think what is perhaps the most important is that extreme far-right propaganda is not hate speech. And that's the kind of misconception that we often have. In fact, it's much more dangerous, whereas I think hate speech itself has been kind of mislabeled as a certain kind of far-right propaganda. So it's often linked to a more emotional response by people, or a kind of venting, or what I call a high five style of conversation, where you talk to your friends and say, look how offensive I am, great, high five, or going to the opposite group and trying to trigger a response. So there are certain social media dynamics going on, and the far-right propaganda, such as the ones represented by the site that I've been discussing, I consider much more dangerous, and because they're trying to provide a very coherent alternative political framing and capitalize, as we saw around the events, on people's responses to terrorist attacks in Europe. So they try to use this swell of anger as a way of getting political power. And that's where I think some of the more danger lies. So I think the question that I want to end up on, and I think we're just in terms of time, is that the debate and the focus on hate speech, and this comes from the Ethiopian background, that in Ethiopia we couldn't really say hate speech is bad because that would mean that they would arrest the journalists. So I think the same applies partially here, that we should not necessarily only focus on the content of hate speech, however offensive and however disgusting it is, but rather we should switch focus from ideas of censorship to looking at more like what I consider more dangerous things that are taking place, such as political polarization, social conflict, and extreme far-right radicalization that is taking place in EU and the US that we should worry about more. So I think part of the debate, while there needs to be a way of trying to address it, to only look at the content of what is being produced and how offensive it is, often hides much more complicated stuff behind it. It's more of a symptom rather than the actual cause of the things. So I think some of the things that should come out of the research that I'm trying to do is that, okay, let's try to look at the problem more in broad terms rather than only focusing on something that we find disgusting and we get very offended by, but might not be that dangerous in the end. It might be my uncle being drunk and saying something because he's finding on social media and thinks he has a voice. So I will end there.
Thank you very much. So your kind of takeaway is it's the meaning rather than the tone that we should be focusing on in terms of hate speech.
Well, the meaning in terms of would be a certain framing of the language,
okay,
which I think is important.
Yep.
But the language is already pre-framed in a way. So part of the hate speech is more about venting, being very offensive, saying certain things. But
that's just noise.
Yes, it's a noise. It's the kind of the murmur in the background.
Okay.
So I think the framing is something where the extreme far rights are trying to very consciously frame the debate in a certain way. So an example would be that the term racism would be also applied to the liberals now, because they're trying to do it. So they're trying to kind of turn it around.
Okay.
So that would be something that would be.
Can you still hear Matti at the back when he sat down?
So now now that I've done with the
into
presentation, I can
okay,
use the mic here. So
we have about 20 minutes for questions. So if we can start off with a couple of questions from Matti. One there and one here.
Yes, I'm Tommaso Virgili from the European Foundation for Democracy. I have two quick questions. The first, which definition of hate speech you assume at the start of your research, because even legally it's very different in the US and in each country of Europe, because the directive is not, the European Union directive is not like precise on that. And the second one, if you notice a reaction from social media in terms of censoring hate speech, how quick is that? If you analyze this phenomenon also in percentage, how much is turned down by Facebook, Twitter, etc.?
Well, I'll start with the first question, is that I try to use hate speech in quotation marks. I think it's a pointless term. I think it can be used to kind of not explain complicated other terms around it. So, of course, as you mentioned, there are many different legal definitions. So Germany has one law, and the US has higher levels of protection of freedom of speech. What is interesting about Finland being a very small country is that there really is no censorship. So Facebook has not deemed Finland to be important enough to set up the mechanism of actually shutting things down. Yeah. So there is very little. There was some kind of backlash against it when it was at its worst in January and February. So there's been some self-censorship that is happening, but there has been no institutional censorship. However, in terms of if you look at Twitter, and because I've been also working for mapping far-right social media networks, so there seems to be also, in terms of Twitter, very little censorship happening. So I mean, of course, in Germany you can't have obvious Nazi symbolism, but they circumvent it by retweeting and using US sites. So the reason why the contrast is very striking is that when you look at, for instance, ISIS, almost every ISIS site gets shut down, or ISIS Twitter account gets shut down within 24 hours. Whereas within the data set of 36,000 sites that we looked at, only one extreme far right was shut down. So again, this is something that is politically very interesting kind of issue.
Okay, thank you. Nadej, you had a question.
Yeah, actually I have two. If I'm not wrong, the extreme right is also part of the government in Finland, or so-called extreme right, if we talk about the real Finnish. And how would that influence also the public opinion and the the speech is there, and also how do they themselves, like communicate on social media, which term would they use, and what kind of the impact would it be? And my other question was that you have this so-called Godwin law, that on social media you would end up talking about Hitler after. That's what they say. Like if you have a discussion, someone at the end of it would discuss extreme right anyway. So how would you have you taken that into account, and how do you think it's linked also to reality? What is being said there? Is it really? I mean, it's difficult to say, of course, but how is it like this phenomenon? How would you?
Yeah. Well, the first question is that most of the anti-immigration discussions would consider the true Finns. They would consider them traitors, and so there's been a very big backlash against them. So the latest polls say that their support has dropped almost 1/3 of what it was during the parliamentary elections, partially because they have to be in government and they have to, in a way, they've been part of the decisions that have people opposed. So again, there's a battle within the far right of who tries to gain power, and it's not very, it's not very politically sophisticated, and we're not dealing with a very massive political movement in Finland in terms of. So the True Finns was the only party that has gained some kind of legitimacy. So in terms of the second point is that, so you mean that, can you explain a bit better that when certain kind of comments happen, it all automatically disintegrates into some.
Well, that's what I had read, that if you, I don't know, if you discuss football, for example, after several exchanges with different people being involved, you will end up talking about extreme right, like or Hitler or whatever.
I think there is a very interesting dynamic going on, because I have the two groups, the anti-racist group and the racist group, which I've been following, is that the anti-immigration group has a massive, they really want to have their voices heard, and this is my own kind of interpretation of it. So they will try to get their voices heard, and when people don't listen to them, they will resort to trolling and all kinds of aggressiveness. So the way I see social media conversations today are basically according to two different dynamics. So you have what I call the high five conversations. So somebody says, look at these immigrants, they're really, really disgusting, and the other says, yes, they are, they're even more disgusting, high five. So it's like people discuss within their own peer groups. So they're, or then if you go to another group, then you try to troll them. So somebody says something, and look at you, liberal idiot, why are you saying this? So there's very little dialogue that in fact takes place. But I think the prevalence partially of the far right now is that they are very eager and aggressive, and they think they're on the rise and they want to get their voice heard. So they will try to go everywhere and take over discussions.
And just as a follow-up, do you see then effect in real life? Like, does it end up like with violence, like I don't know, against refugee, or do you see like also a rise? Like
there has no correlation so far.
Okay.
So there has been no correlation between attacks and so, okay, it's very hard to measure that. There has been some attacks in Finland, but then I don't think it has been linked to the prevalence of hate speech that has been going on. The attacks would be, so they're, unlike Germany where it's been very much more systematic, or Sweden where there has been, so I think this kind of discussion, it's very hard to make the link that in fact when people curse a lot they would also go out and do something about it. You could also say the contrary, that they are very angry and they want to vent something out, and it's like almost like a safety mechanism. What's going on?
And just last question, and I leave the floor. Do you also have like a high level of Islamic radicalization, or is it mainly far right that you have to deal with in Finland? Or?
Well, I haven't looked at the Islamic radicalization. That's other part of the VOX-Pol network. So, but in Finland it's very limited.
Okay.
And again, I think some of these dynamics are also applicable to other European countries with some modifications in terms of like at least the methods of looking at them. But Finland, because it had this very unique kind of conversation, I was very interested also to look at how the potential for dialogue in between that takes place, which is a very interesting effort, because they set up rules of what would be hate speech free discussion. So you can't curse, you have to use facts, and so there's a whole list of guidelines that they have developed together, which in fact is a very good guideline of how you should have conversations. Not that they often follow them, but at least on paper it seems to, on theory it seems to be very good. So in that sense, so I think the Islamic radicalization is a very different story. So you should perhaps ask Lisa about. She might have much more.
I don't know about Finnish radicalization.
Well, Finland's a very the irony behind the whole thing is that Finland is probably one of these peaceful, consensus-loving countries where nothing is supposed to happen. But I think the conversation in Finland is the most violent. So in terms of like relationship between politics and violence, we are seeing a very complicated, bizarre relationship. That the less there's aggression on the the most peaceful country would have the most violent conversation. So it doesn't make sense. So that's one of the puzzles that I'm also trying to see that why is there so much violent discussion when there's very little violence offline?
Do the conversations that you've looked at, do they relate specifically to Finland, or are they wider? Because conversations I look at, although they're UK based, they relate to Europe as a whole, Western culture, Western European as a sort of unit.
Well,
ironically enough.
there's a lot of spillover from other discussions. Also language then is an issue there. So it depends. So one of the big themes, of course, anti-Islamism and the defense of Western civilization. So the kind of counter-jihadi crusade that is going on, very popular. Alt-right is slightly making some movements. There's a lot of Trump support recently that has been taking place. So, but they do. The politics tends to be much more local, but kind of ideology is definitely influenced by some of the external websites.
Okay.
So, like the MV magazine, which I mentioned, they try to find any possible case of violence against white people by Muslims, and they post immediately. So that's the primary thing they do. They look at all kinds of rape cases, and so they would use any news source. They would copy from any site to something that would prove their point.
Okay. More questions? Does anyone else have a question for Matti?
Is there anybody from Finland in the audience? Okay. Yeah, no, that was one of my concerns, that I have to try to explain the context. And do you think some of these dynamics would then apply more broadly to what people have been observing? Because I think, again, one of the things that I was interested in is trying to understand the broader context and the kind of what happens. And that's why I looked at such a massive big data set to see what is going on around that.
And regarding policy recommendation, would you recommend to have sort of regulation, a stronger one, regarding freedom of speech, or would you say like if they do it online then it's better and let's let them interact online, or how would you address that if you were a policymaker?
I have an Excel file of which are very aggressively worded hate speech comments, about 6,000, which includes about 2,000 names. So it's very, in terms of policing, would you go arrest the 2,000 people, or would you find them, or would you do something with that? Of course, something needs to be done with it. I don't agree. I don't think it's a good phenomenon. I don't think discussion should be like that. But what I'm interested in trying to see what would be a better way of doing things. So I think I would actually go all the way into and the other part of my research has been looking at kind of different ways of understanding kind of online extremism and hate speech, and I would go more into like conflict mediation. So my background in conflict studies also coming back from. So if there is conflict in outside Europe, usually you do conflict mediation, and if you do conflict in Europe in between extremist groups and something, you usually do counter-violent extremism. So that tends to be also. So I would actually go more into conflict mediation to see why are these conflicts developing and emerging in society in the first place. Because I think it's the biggest threat is now polarization, not really hate speech. So why is it that in the US there seems to be a quasi-civil war developing between two different candidates? Why is that Brexit has led to such polarization in the UK? Why is it that Germany has such massive polarization? Why is it that Finland has this massive polarization that is exemplified by these different groups? So I don't know what policy, maybe people in Brussels would be more capable of answering that. How do you counter polarization? So why don't we have a counter polarization task force?
You looked at there was a mediation group, and that was very clear that there was this huge polarization and this little group that's kind of engaging with both. Could you see what the effects of that mediation were on either the extreme right or the countering group? Could you see what was going on as a result of that? That led to this conclusion that you need more mediation?
Well, what I've observed is that the people on the extreme anti-immigration side are desperate to get their voices heard, and because they are much more on the margins, and then the anti-race tend to be very mainstream, so they are very comfortable in their own. So they are actually less engaging, whereas the people, however clumsy it is, they are trying to engage. So, but the way they lack the vocabulary to do it in a civilized way. They do it by being very offensive and doing stuff. So I think there's also a very big class issue at play. That there's certain kind of class-based conversation of how you're supposed to carry out a political discussion. And if you don't subscribe to a certain more middle-class liberal way of discussing politics, it's very difficult to cross the bridge, or bridge that divide between because people who are not educated, let's say, to a university degree, carry on a conversation very differently.
Okay.
So I think there's something like that going on down there, and I think it's also very. So again, I think there should be media literacy, and I think people should be taught to, okay, these are the ways you actually have a political conversation. I think this is a very fundamental issue that we should go to the core of how we actually. I think it goes to the heart of democracy. In a very, I mean, I'm talking about a few Facebook pages, but if you take the more serious kind of implications of what is there.
This is probably the wrong way round, but I actually would like just like a little bit of context on, you know, how much of a mainstream focus is immigration to Finland in the mainstream press in Finland, because we've had groups like Warriors of Odin doing patrols. I mean, there has been activity going on in offline in Finland, which has had some publicity. Can you just say a bit about what that offline context is?
These two groups, when I had one of basically, let me go back to this one slide, which is just the context for it. I went through a lot of issues, but the biggest ever protest that has been organized in Finland, one of the biggest, was actually done by the Rasmus group, one of the groups that I looked at, which was done in response to the rise of hate speech. And so we had two different protests. So the Close the Borders group might get about 100 people, 150 people, and they had about 20,000 for the anti-race group. So you can see again, the support is not that massive, and you have groups like Soldiers of Odin. Most of them have now dissipated or vanished. So they were much more popular in about January or beginning of this year. And the situation was so that there was nationwide discussion in all major media about there's something toxic going on, that we need to actually try to address it. So all the way to the president they had TV debates, everything about this issue. So it was very discussed in mainstream,
right,
which was about polarization, hate speech, what's going on. And
online or offline?
Well, offline you haven't had that many incidents. Soldiers of Odin had got a lot of press. They were very popular, especially outside Finland. But as a group, I don't know if they patrolled once a week for a couple hours, and in the end they were always followed by a group of clowns, which is called Soldiers of Odin, which was an anti-fascist group. The point that they got so fed up that they stopped doing it. So they had this. So there was sort of.
When you say clowns, you mean people
dressed
up as clowns?
Yeah. So there was a big anti-fascist kind of group that went against it. So again, they have been much more active online, but less. There seems to be less that has been going on offline. Whether it's that sentiment simmering somewhere that they haven't done it because it's not a kind of protest action. It's not the biggest Finnish characteristic. So, but then I think it's much more an online phenomenon.
And how big are migration levels, refugee levels in
There's about 40,000 that came.
Okay.
And now they're, so I mean, it was reasonably big. I mean, nothing compared to Germany, but for a small country. So that was the kind of catalyst that brought a lot of discussions before. But they, of course, then they ran against Somalians and all the other kind of prior waves of immigration that came on.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions or observations as a result of the talk? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Matti. It just remains to say thank you before we break for lunch. There are reports at the back of the room. Please feel free to pick those up, and more information about VOX-Pol. Next week, actually, I'm meant to be talking about suspension on Twitter and the impact that has on communities of ISIS supporters, looking at gender working in that. But if we just say thank you again to Matti, who's come from Finland, for the presentation today.
And if there are any further questions, just send me an email, and I'm very happy
or grab
to,
him over
or
sandwiches.
Grab me and I'll discuss. There's a lot of stuff there.
Nicely grab him, not
peacefully grab me.
yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.